Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/WeHaveWays. Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the Second World War podcast with all your Second World War needs. And achtung, probably inappropriate, James, for what we're about to talk about, though. Lord knows, I don't know what the Karen for achtung is. Do you?
I don't, I'm afraid. I know what Japanese say in Commando comics, which is ai or banzai, but I don't think that's appropriate either.
No, probably not. Welcome to our first part. We think of 6, but like the jungle, maybe we'll be drawn in, of look at Imphal and Kohima, the epic titanic battles of the early summer of 1944 in Burma, now Myanmar, of course. Well, not really in Burma, actually, on the border of Burma and India, because this, after all, this part of the Second World War kind of happens in the Assam Hills.
Yep, and we're talking about Bengal here, which of course is now modern-day Bangladesh, and we're talking about Assam and parts of what is now Manipur State and Nagaland in northeast India. We're talking about Calcutta, which of course is now Calcutta, and the Bay of Bengal and all that, and down into Burma, which then in turn links into what was Malaya is now Malaysia, which then links into Singapore and borders Thailand and parts of China, southwest China. So it's that big area of what becomes known in the Second World War in the autumn of 1943 as Southeast Asia Command. But actually, we've got a very, very good quote about the challenges facing the British leadership in the autumn of 1943, which I think is really good because it sets out just geographically, since we've started on that point, the challenges. And this is, of course, General Bill Slim.
Well, who else? Let's be honest now. Who else could it possibly be, Jim?
Who else could it possibly be? Immediately on taking over, I found myself confronted by 3 major anxieties: supply, health, and morale. Supply was, of course, largely a matter of communications. The 14th Army was deployed on a 700-mile front, from the Chinese frontier beyond Fort Hearts to the Bay of Bengal. Along the Indo-Burmese border, in a shallow curve, sweeps the wide belt of jungle-clad, precipitous hills, railless, roadless, and for 6 months of the year during the monsoon rains, almost trackless. Sparsely populated by wild tribes, disease-infested, and even unmapped in places, much of this great area had been penetrated by only occasional Europeans, and then only in the dry season. It could be fairly described as some of the world's worst country, breeding the world's worst diseases and having for half the year, at least, the world's worst climate. To move even small pack caravans by the few dry weather tracks from Burma to India was so difficult that no proper trading route existed. To supply, move and fight great armies in or through the mass of jumbled hills had for so long been regarded as impossible that no serious defense measures had ever been taken on India's eastern frontier. Nor had any effective communications either for trade or war been built. Such roads, railways, and navigable rivers as there were stopped abruptly each side of the mountain barrier, a couple of 100 miles apart. So there you have it. That spells it out pretty clearly, I think.
I mean, the challenges are bonkers. And what's interesting, actually, though, is that the British have faced them before in taking Burma in the first place. Burma's annexed in 1886, but the first Anglo-Burmese war is 1824 to 1826. It's old history, this, right? And it almost bankrupts British India, at the expense of trying to run a campaign in Burma. And then you've 2 more wars. So Rangoon is your waypoint between Singapore and Calcutta, is the point. You coastally...
And Ceylon, of course.
Yeah, you hop along the coast because this interior is so forbidding and difficult to operate in that obviously this is your coastal hopping imperial territory, isn't it? What matters isn't the hinterland, it's holding the coast. So you can hop along, you get your trading posts going, and then, of course, oil is discovered and rice export. That's the other really big part
timber.
of Burmese economy is the export of rice. You'd think it was this kind of, again, a golden opportunity for an exterior power to go, we've come to set you all free. As ever, the Japanese, not unlike the Germans in Eastern Europe, The Japanese just can't do that.
Because they have this ideology of extreme racism.
Yeah.
And Japanese supremacy.
Yeah, to be the beneficent liberator. It's impossible for them. So there's that in the mix too. And as Slim points out, I mean, the weather is either, it's 45 degrees and up in the interior in high summer, and then basically rains constantly. The temperature's dropped to sort of 30 degrees for the monsoon, but it rains all the time. We were on holiday in Cambodia last week.
Oh, yes, of course we were, yeah.
I couldn't sleep on the way out, so and there were crappy films, so I put that flight thing on. And then I'm looking out my window over Burma for hours, looking at my watch, looking at the distances and seeing the places on the flight map, Pinway and all these places, Rangoon, names of places that are part of the story of the fighting, the campaign there, and realising how enormous it is. Before we came online to chat about this, you sent over this amazing little graphic that I think we'll put up at some point, which shows the size of Burma. It overlays from south of Marseille and down south of, into
up
Spain.
Up to the top of Denmark or something.
Up to the top of Denmark. Yeah.
It's huge.
Well beyond the top of Holland and level with Hull, basically. I mean, it's just extraordinary for its sheer length. So before we even, I think Slim in his modest style says, supply is the problem. Well, that's always the military problem, isn't it? Supply, logistics. But the fact is, he don't get no mulberry.
No. What we're going to do in this series is we're going to look at the situation in the autumn of 1943 with the creation of Southeast Asia Command and the first Supreme Allied Commander. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the situation there. We're going to then have a little kind of throwback to what's happened to British fortunes in this area. Then we're going to look at how the British attempt to turn 14th Army around and their combined air, land and sea operations around. Then we're going to be looking at the Battle of the Admin Box, followed by the second half of the series. We'll be focusing mainly on Imphal and Kohima, with a little nod to the Chindits as well. So that's how we're going to do it. But I think we should start now it's the 22nd of October, 1943. And Mountbatten has just been appointed Supreme Allied Commander. Now, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Admiral Louis Mountbatten, has had to be promoted several posts to kind of jump above his new subordinates. He's only 42 years old, I think, at this time. And to say that his appointment raises eyebrows would be a colossal understatement, because particularly in India Command, where generals are silver-haired, have moustaches and swagger sticks, and are of a certain type, and he's not. He's very young, he's dark-featured, square-jawed, film star good looks.
He's sexy, Jim, let's say it.
Let's say he's sexy, come on, he's sexy. But I'm fabulously well connected with royalty, with generals, with film stars. He's great personal friends with Noel Coward.
He's also, let's be honest now, he's Teflon. He's had all sorts of disasters before him.
And they just slide off his back.
They just slide off in charge of command operations. Dieppe is his disaster.
But one of the reasons he's appointed, apart from his film star good looks and connections and his quite deliberately not looking like your archetypal British Indian Army officer, is that he's an admiral. He knows about amphibious operation. The thinking is in the summer of 1943 at the Quebec conference, is that the way to win in Burma is not even try and get round all these jungles and these chin hills and all the rest of it. And we'll kind of, get into Rangoon on the coast by amphibious assault. So that's the other reason. Of course, he's commanded his own ship. He's an admiral, but he's also commanded combined operations. So he knows that kind of air, land, sea picture. He's also been on the Higher Commander's Staff course. He's got detailed knowledge of high-level strategy and coalition warfare, because he's been part of he sat on the Chiefs of Staff Committee for 18 months.
But Jim, is there a sense that he's a big beast? He's unconventional, gossiping about stuff he shouldn't.
Yeah, no, it's a risk. There's no question it's a risk.
He's kind of leaky and all that sort of thing, isn't he?
All that kind of stuff. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it's not just his youth and all the rest of it. It's the reputation he has as being a bit of a loose cannon, frankly.
Is it to get him out of Europe?
I think it's quite simply, they want someone who is going to be able to get on with Chiang Kai-shek. More importantly, is going to be able to get on with the Americans and is not going to kind of bristle and rub up the Americans the wrong way with that kind of old school kind of Britishness.
Yes, because he's not old-fashioned.
He's not old-fashioned. He hangs out in Hollywood and he knows Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
Yeah, it's what it comes down to, is he's not old-fashioned. At this stage of the war, not late 43, you are making sure you accommodate the Chinese. And it's later in the war that the Chinese basically go by the wayside, certainly for the Americans, because the Americans are calling the shots really in this theatre, actually, because it's American supply that we end up relying on and the Chinese end up relying on. he's also got to deal with Stilwell, and you need someone who is really brilliant with people to deal with Stilwell, don't you?
Yeah, you absolutely do. And it's interesting that when he comes out, he flies first to Delhi, obviously, and then goes straight on to Chongqing to see Chiang Kai-shek and also to see Stilwell. And he makes a very, very good impression on Chiang and also Mrs. Chiang, who's not averse to kind of good-looking young men. And Chiang agrees to this unified command that Chinese troops will fall under. The troops at Stilwell, General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, the American general that is in theatre in China, advising Chiang and also helping to train some of his Chinese forces, that they will also fall under Southeast Asia Command. He's expecting a much bigger fight, and Chiang goes, no, that's absolutely fine. So it all goes really well, and he hits it off with Stilwell as well, which is good. And I'm sure part of that is precisely because he's not kind of silver-haired with a little moustache and swagger stick and bristling and kind of trying to impose himself on Stilwell. He sort of treats him no sense of condescension. I think that's really the point. So after that, he then goes to Barrackpore, and Barrackpore is the headquarters of Eastern Army. There is no such thing as 14th Army at this point on the 22nd of October. It is called Eastern Army, and that is the army that has been fighting on the Burma frontier in the Arakan, in the northwest corner of Burma. But it's the monsoon, and so there's, everyone's both sides, the Japanese and the British and the Eastern Army are both kind of pretty exhausted. And so there's this kind of sort of hiatus while everyone kind of thinks, okay, well, what are we going to do? What are the Allies going to do? And what are the Japanese going to do? And the acting Eastern Army commander is General Bill Slim, Lieutenant General Bill Slim. And doesn't like Barrackpore at all. It's a suburb north of the main part of Calcutta. It lies on the banks of the Hooghly River. It's surrounded by slums. It's this old viceregal lodge, which is very nice. I've been there, actually, and it's a lovely spot.
Well, I've been up the Hooghly too, and it's very agreeable if you hold your nose. Stretch the river.
Don't swim in it.
Don't swim in it. And then you go down to the bank and there are people actually bathing in it. You think, right, well, look, I'm not here to criticise anyone like a big fat white whale, but but honestly, lads, clean your teeth in that if you want.
As a lily-livered Westerner, just don't do
exactly,
it. Okay, that's just my top tip. If you,
exactly.
You worry about going in the Thames, this is on a whole different level of toxicity. Anyway, so there he is, and Mountbatten's plane swirls in, and it's still got the old rondel with the kind of the red centre of it. And Slim thinks, oh my God, I hope he doesn't get shut down. This is going to be awful. But it's all fine. Mountbatten appears. He's very suave, looks friendly. They go and have a chat. And first of all, Slim says, oh, will you address my staff? So Mountbatten goes and addresses the staff and does this big spiel, and it just falls completely flat. And then Slim and Mountbatten go off and sort of chat in Slim's office. And Mountbatten goes, God, that didn't go very well, did it? And Slim goes, no, don't worry about it at all. No, it's all absolutely fine. And they start chatting. And Slim starts talking about his ideas, and Mountbatten's ideas are exactly the same, that they need to turn things around, that they need to kind of radically improve all sorts of different areas, from training to medical supplies to infrastructure to all sorts of stuff, and that they need a complete reset. And Mountbatten is really impressed with what Slim has to say. And he goes, look, I want you to be my new army commander. And Slim kind of almost sort of chokes on his tea and says, well, with great respect, don't you think you need to talk to General Gifford? So General George Gifford is the army group commander, because it also includes Ceylon, now modern-day Sri Lanka. He took over in May as Eastern Army commander. Then they had this other big change at the top. Wavell, who had been C&C India after his sacking in the Western Desert in Middle East, rather the commander-in-chief of the Middle East in the summer of 1941. He is now the viceroy. And Auchinleck, who followed him in the Middle East and was also subsequently sacked, is now C&C of India. Gifford has come as Army Group Commander, which is why Slim, who was 15 Corps Commander, has now been made acting Eastern Army Commander.
I mean, it's hard not to look at this theatre as a sort of dumping ground, right?
Yeah, sort of passed over everyone else. It's sort of second tier.
It's like, what they call people in Hong Kong? Failed in London, try Hong Kong. You gave it your best in the desert, lads. Never mind, go off to the jungle and see what you can do about that. It's not encouraging, is it? So it's remarkable that Slim actually is there, and this doesn't constitute a spoiler for anyone who listens to this podcast, turns out to be the ideal appointment. The guy. Well,
we're going to look at Slim and his rise shortly, but at this point, Mountbatten says, well, no, I want you to be my new commander. And Slim says, well, I think you need to maybe say, with the greatest respect, you need to kind of check with a few other people. And Mountbatten goes, no, I don't. I'm a Supreme Allied Commander. I like you. I want you to be the commander. If they don't like it, they can just go swing. And Slim goes, okay, All right.
It's absolutely amazing.
Needless to say, Auchinleck and Gifford are not particularly impressed about not being consulted about this, but Mountbatten just cheerily breezes his way through it. He says, "Oh, don't kick up a fuss about this. Honestly, this guy's the man. You know, I'm all about being decisive." And it's actually a brilliant, brilliant decision. The one thing that Slim says to him is, look, I just think part of this new reset is we need a new name. We can't call this Eastern Army anymore. And Mountbatten goes, okay, well, what do you want to call it then? And he goes, well, I think it needs a number. You know, we've got 8th Army, we need a number. So they go back to London and say, what can we call it? Comes back with 14th Army. And 14th Army is born in the middle of November 1943, and that's what it becomes. And Slim is its first commander-in-chief, because it's no longer Eastern Army. But let's just do very, very quick background for those who don't know. Very, very quickly. We're not going to linger on this because this is a bit swearing when Britain gets defeated, and I'm not interested in that. Moving swiftly on. So, Japanese attack, obviously Pearl Harbor, December 41, Hong Kong, take that. General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, all the rest of it, he comes in with 36,000 men and sweeps everyone aside, takes over Malaya, moves into Singapore. Singapore falls in February 1942. It's a complete disaster. And then there is the retreat through Burma with the Burma Corps. As they retreat, the British set fire to the oil wells, which is at the time the largest fire in history. Alexander is brought in to oversee the retreat across the Irrawaddy, this huge great river that runs in the north of Burma, back into India, over the Shenam Saddle, which is now Manipur State, and much more of that later on in this series. Slim is his corps commander. So it is an Alexander and Slim axis. They complete that by May 1942, and then there is the monsoon.
It's calamitous, though. You know, it's
calamitous.
Sittang Bridge gets blown before people are across it. Packets of Stuart tanks holding the enemy up, and the British get hung up on holding places rather than fighting the Japanese. And the Japanese are completely invested in mobility and destroying the enemy. So we'll encircle you, we'll bypass you, we'll grab your supplies. They're not interested in Rangoon per se. They're interested in defeating Burma Corps and the Indian Army, because after all, you've disparate elements fighting for the British Empire in Burma as well. And it's all uncoordinated and all over the place. These are things that Slim's going to himself, right, this is how the Japanese fight. Our remedy didn't work. He's very interesting on when he gets his guys out, how coherent they are at the end of it and how actually they march out and they're all in good order. And he says to himself, these are the things we need to concentrate on and look at as much as anything else. There is leadership lessons from that defeat. So what's quite interesting is he's already digesting those lessons where lots of other people are going, Christ, what happened there? Well,
yes, and unfortunately, Alexander, who also has a very, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in the next episode, he also recognizes that it's not about its land per se, it's about holding and stopping the Japanese from taking over and then capturing your supplies. And it's also about harnessing air power, which Alexander is very into, as we've discussed many times about the Mediterranean and all the rest of it. So Alexander then kind of relinquishes command, soon after the successful retreat back into India. But Slim stays in the areas. His Burma Corps becomes 15 Corps. And instead of promoting him, they then bring in a chap called General Noel Irwin, who'd last seen action in Norway. And, is a perfectly competent general for European traditional warfare, but kind of all at sea out in Southeast Asia. And he launches the Arakan campaign. So then it's the monsoon again. So for 6 months, it's just this torrential rain coming down. No one's fighting. Japanese are staying put in Burma. British are staying put in India. No one's doing anything. But the British are quietly kind of building up strength in Bengal, south of Chittagong, which is now modern-day Bangladesh, and with the intention of kind of pushing into the Arakan, which is this area of northwest Burma, which is now the kind of where the Rohingyas are being persecuted and all the rest of it, which has been in the news, unfortunately, in recent times. He then launches this attack when the monsoon dries up in kind of the end of 1942, and it's a complete disaster. It just doesn't get anywhere.
It's horrendous.
It is, he is again just throwing infantry battalions at fixed Japanese positions in hills and just getting absolutely nowhere. And it's a complete disaster. And they haven't got the right kit. They haven't got enough tanks. They've got a few Hurricanes, which are kind of the equal of Oscars, which is the kind of army equivalent of the Zero, but they're not superior to.
And he deploys the tanks in penny packets as well. He doesn't use them in concentration.
He just gets it completely wrong. He gets it completely, totally wrong. So the winter campaign of 1942, 1943 is just a complete disaster. And for the most part of this, Slim is sitting this out, training 15 Corps up in Ranchi and stuff. But I think it'd be worth just giving a bit of kind of bio detail on Slim. But let's take a break. And then when we come back, we can look at Bill Slim.
Hello, this is William Dalrymple here from the Empire Podcast, also from Goalhanger, and I'm here to tell you about a new miniseries we've just done on the Vietnam War. I'm from the generation of kids that grew up on Apocalypse Now and went to bed memorizing phrases like, I love the smell of napalm in the morning, but this series, I think, really is something we really get to the heart of this conflict that consumed so much of both American and Southeast Asian post-war history. In America, it consumed 6 presidents and led to America dropping more bombs on Vietnam than they did in the entirety of the Second World War, and the loss of millions of lives. It also, of course, encouraged the cynicism about government that has become so prevalent in modern America and its politics. And it harvested this incredible host of films and literary works of art. I grew up on books like Dispatches, and we've mentioned Apocalypse Now, but also The Deer Hunter, Sorrow of War, Full Metal Jacket. It goes on and on and on. So if you want to know more about this war, and the titanic scar it left across the whole of Southeast Asia, but also very much on the American psyche, we have left an excerpt from the miniseries at the end of this episode for you to enjoy.
Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, part 1 of our Burma 44. Needless to say, it's Burma 44, so we're talking about Burma 43 right now. Such is the nature of this podcast.
Yes, and actually most of it doesn't take place in Burma. So,
other than that, we're spot on target. We said before the break we'd talk about Bill Slim, and he's a fascinating character, isn't he?
He really is.
He's an Indian Army man. Make no mistake, that's one of the interesting things about him.
Yeah, although not originally.
That's it, isn't it? He's given his career to it.
Yep, so he's 56 in 1943, born in 1891 in Birmingham. He's a very humble background. You know, a bit like our new Prime Minister, he's the son of a metal worker. So he wins a scholarship to the local grammar school, because these grammar schools they're pretty good, but if you can't afford them, there are fees involved. There are tuition fees involved. So you have to win a scholarship to get there.
If you're the son of an ironmonger in Birmingham, you're the hub of British industry. You know, it's a city that's expanding and being rebuilt and re-engineered and pioneered by the Chamberlains. You're part of a place that has this huge sort of metropolitan impetus behind it. So then he goes to become a teacher,
primary school teacher, and he works in Birmingham slums. It's absolutely amazing, and he's grown up reading, you know, history and tales of daring do and high veld, all that kind of stuff. So he's joined, when he's been at the grammar school in Birmingham, he's joined the school's cadet force and then the Birmingham University OTC, Officer Training Corps. So then war comes in 1914 and he's given a temporary commission in the 9th Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, which of course is Monty's old regiment. But because it's the 9th Battalion, he's not posted to France, he's posted to Gallipoli, where he's wounded pretty badly in August 1915. So he then gets shipped back to England, recuperating, finally got out of hospital past fit in 1916 and posted as a captain to the West India Regiment, so out of the Royal Warwickshires. And then again, rather than being sent to the Western Front, he's sent to Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq, arriving just after the siege of Kut.
This whole part of the First World War, when people think of mud, blood and poppycock, what about what's going on in this part of the world?
Yeah, heat, sun and also poppycock, but also typhus and dengue fever.
Exactly, and all sorts of calamitous misunderstandings and, you know, lone aeroplanes appearing and everyone running away and all that sort of stuff. It's quite extraordinary. But he wins in it, he's wounded again, picks up a military cross, and then he's invalided to India. And that's the interesting thing, isn't it?
The path to his future greatness and his future sort of career in the Indian Army starts with his posting to Mesopotamia and then post-wound being invalided to India. I mean, it's just amazing.
And electing to stay there, transfer to the Indian Army.
And becoming a staff officer, which is so important for future high command. You have to have had that combination of frontline command experience. Being wounded a couple of times is not exceptional at all, but it does help because it shows that you're kind of fearless and brave and you've taken it on the chin and all that kind of stuff. And having been in India, he sort of thinks, well, I quite like this, you know. And, you know, he's an officer, and so he's treated as such. He's treated with respect. And you're thinking, should I be teaching in the slums of Birmingham, or do I hang out here and further my career and get a decent career and sort of sip pink gins of an evening?
He's ended up in Kipling land.
He's ending up in Kipling land, which, of course, he's been reading when he was a boy. So,
but later in life, in between the wars, he writes a load of fiction that is about tales from the sort of bazaar and all this sort of thing that is indistinguishable from Kipling, really.
He's clever and hungry for adventure, hungry to kind of burnish his mind and with experiences and sights and all the rest of it. So it's completely, absolutely understandable that he stays there. And he ends up joining the 6th Gurkha Rifles. And he learns Gurkhali and Urdu, which is a requirement of British Indian Army officers. And over the next 20 years, splits between staff jobs, frontline action along the North frontier. And he does well without being exceptional. And I think this is the really interesting thing about Slim. Slim is one of those lucky officers. He doesn't get killed at Gallipoli. He gets wounded and survives. He doesn't get sent to the Western Front. He gets sent to Mesopotamia where he's wounded, but survives. He does perfectly well, but not exceptionally. And that means that in the outbreak of war in 1939, he's posted to the Middle East and then to East Africa, by which time he's commanding a brigade. The great thing about going to East Africa for Slim is that you can make mistakes there and they're not really noticed.
Yes, no one really cares.
And you can learn, and you need to make mistakes to become the finished article. But he has quite a big mistake in Abyssinia, where he's commanding 10th Brigade. So he's commanding 10th Brigade in Abyssinia, and he does make quite a big mistake because he places his 1st Essex Battalion in an old fort at Gallabat. Basically, you're kind of cramping them all into these 4 square walls, and it makes him a very obvious target for Italian bombers who, sure enough, come over, start dropping bombs, and the Essex men panic and start fleeing, which is, as a brigade commander, you really don't want any of your men kind of running away. But it goes under the radar to a certain extent because it's in Abyssinia. It's a long way from kind of prying eyes. And even in the Abyssinia, brigades and units are quite a long way apart. And, you can kind of keep it reasonably, a lid on it, so to speak. And so he emerges from the Abyssinia campaign, which ultimately obviously is a huge victory for the British anyway, with his reputation not only intact, but actually enhanced.
The thing is, if you screw up during a campaign that's a victory, people are less likely to examine it, aren't they? Is the thing. If the whole thing had been a disaster, then he might have been sacked. As it is, everything went well, so let's not worry about it.
Because he's ambitious, he thinks, okay, I'm going to learn from this. I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm going to kind of, he's constantly thinking and evolving. And suddenly it's clear that there is this chink where he suddenly thinks, oh my God, I've been a brigadier. Next thing he knows, he's an acting major general and commanding a division in Syria and then Iraq. And now it's time to get serious. And this long kind of apprenticeship of going from, the First World War, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, these different climates, these different landscapes, particularly where your logistical challenges are absolutely enormous. What Slim understands is instinctively how to command men effectively and get the best out of them. But he also understands, crucially, that operational level. And that operational level is particularly important when you're fighting in Abyssinia, when you're fighting in Iraq, when you're fighting, of course, in Burma.
His other stroke of luck, though, also is that the Indian Army is essentially decapitated. That there's a whole load of other talent, other colleagues who are removed from the pecking order, aren't they?
Exactly. So suddenly they're kind of thinking, oh my God, we're short of all these people. Who can we get in? They bring in Alexander. The reason they bring in Alexander, of course, is because although he's a Guards officer, he was in the Irish Guards originally, he has commanded the Nowshera Brigade in the 1930s, so he's the obvious senior commander with proven battlefield experience, the guy who was the kind of last man out at Dunkirk, this is Alexander, to go in and be overall in charge of the kind of retreat from Burma and getting back into India. But they also need a corps commander, and Slim has, since Abyssinia, has proved himself very well, and he's got this huge experience, and he's got this experience of logistics and operating over difficult terrain with kind of not very much. He's the ideal person, and he's available. So he is brought in to command the Burma Corps alongside Alexander and does really, really well because, again, they pull it off. They get them back across India. They get them back across the Shenam Saddle and in pretty good order. And he also gets credit for a number of really good, well-fought rearguard actions. And there is a sense that here is a man who's got a clear head, who can think through properly. He also recognises, as does Alexander recognise, and we've talked about this just a moment ago, is that this is about asymmetric warfare. It's not about conventional warfare here. That, the terrain and the landscape and the logistical challenges work against you when it comes to conventional fighting.
The terrain also works against the enemy if you can think clearly about it. And this is the key point, isn't it? Is that the terrain is a leveler rather than a thing that helps the Japanese. They're having as much trouble with it as you are, actually.
Absolutely. But then into this. So Alexander then goes back to England and then takes over, as we know, comes Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East in August 1942. By which time Noel Irwin has arrived to take over the newly formed Eastern Army. And Slim is given 15th Corps, but then packed off to Ranchi. And the two divisions he's given, 14th and 26th Divisions, are then taken away by Irwin which just seems utterly bizarre. And he's given new divisions, the 70th Division and the 50th Armoured Brigade, to train. And it's absolutely clear that Irwin doesn't want this experienced Burma guy under him, undermining his own authority and way of doing things. So he's going to pack Slim off, go to Ranchi, get into training. And what Slim does while he's in Ranchi is he really trains them. I mean, they do proper patrol work and jungle training and all this kind of stuff. And Irwin is kind of on his own with this kind of new army, new cause, fighting the Arakan campaign. And as we were saying earlier on, it goes terribly. It's just traditional tactics, just flinging one battalion after another. They get absolutely nowhere. And leading the attack by the kind of spring of, by March 1943 is the 14th Division. What Irwin has done is just added one more infantry battalion after another. So he sends an infantry battalion in, they get decimated, he then sends another one in and another one and another one. It's basically the same mistake that they make on the top of Snake's Head Ridge at Casino. This very narrow funnel and just, it becomes a kind of meat grinder. So 14th Division is swollen to 3 times its normal size. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous.
And the Japanese have dug into the jungle with sort of mutually protected positions so they can fire on their own positions and all this sort of stuff. So whatever the British do, you're always enfiladed, essentially. So when they figure out that maybe they need some armour, they haven't got enough, and he applies it, as we said earlier, in penny packets, so it gets picked off too. They just can't solve any of the problems that actually they're creating for themselves, because he's not thinking in terms of mobility, he's not thinking in terms of outflanking, he's thinking we'll grind our way through eventually, somehow.
But he's also thinking immense political pressure from above saying you've got to sort this out. And so he's just an increasing sense of desperation. And actually Slim is about to go off on leave, and he's heading off with his wife Aileen and his daughter Una, and he's on the train when suddenly a message arrives, gets handed to him at a halt. The woodcock are fighting, and this is the code for sending 15 Corps immediately to the front. So he has to get off the train, say goodbye to his wife again, which he says is one of the most miserable he's had of many over the kind of, the 25 years of marriage they've had or whatever. And off he goes, and he gets to the front and discovers that Irwin wants him to go and kind of observe and say, okay, well, what should we be doing? And basically what Irwin's trying to do is he's trying to put Slim center stage so he can do one of two things. He can either help Irwin get out of the jam he's in, or he can blame Slim if it goes completely wrong. So he's trying to cover all bases by sending Slim on this fact-finding mission. What he discovers is that 14th Division is utterly finished, despite having these kind of sort of 17 infantry brigades or whatever it's got. They're losing 50 men a day to disease on top of battle casualties. And Slim just says, they're busted flush. There's only one thing we can do here, and that's retreat. But Irwin refuses. It makes absolutely no difference whatsoever because they lose Bufidang and they lose Maungdaw, which are two kind of little villages, towns. Eventually, Irwin has to concede defeat and falls back in May. And it's a terrible humiliation, which has fallen on top of huge humiliation of defeat in Malaya and Singapore and Burma the previous year. So, every which way you look at it, it's not good.
This is happening at the same time as the rout of the Germans in Tunisia.
Guadalcanal has been won by the Americans.
Exactly. And so there's a sense of what is it about that part of the world? Why can't these people get this right? So this is long after Churchill saying, find me some generals who will fight, isn't it?
But it's also this sense that the Raj is finished, that it's the death knell. And, we'll talk in the next episode. We'll talk a bit about kind of, the Quit India campaign and the Bengal famine and other problems that are going on in India.
But it's also one thing fighting a war of national survival against the Germans. It's another fighting, what is this war? Why are we trying to retake Burma? If you're a Tommy, what is the point of any of this?
And you're fighting against these fanatical Japanese with their swords and, who seem superhuman and all the rest of it. So it's a complete mess. Anyway, on the 26th of May, 1943, Slim has 2 telegrams. The first is from Irwin, which is very critical of his handling of the retreat from the Arakan, which, of course, is, covering his back. And the second one is from a staff officer summoning back to Barrackpore. And Slim assumes that he's going to be sacked. And just thinks, well, that's it, and thinks I'm going back to England and I'll take up a position in the Home Guard. But much to his surprise, it is Irwin who is sacked. Back home and in Delhi, no one has been fooled by this. They realise that the problem is entirely kind of, the ineptitude of Noel Irwin. He gets sacked, and George Gifford, who is the former Commander-in-Chief of West Africa Command, takes over, and Wavell is made Viceroy, and Claude Auchinleck is made CNC of India. The second summons is from Gifford wanting to confer with his senior corps commander. So actually, yet again, he's been saved. Different people at different time. It could have been him on the...
Yeah, but they've got Irwin's number is what this boils down to.
It is, but they might not have done. They might have listened to his recommendation. Irwin might have been sacked and Slim as well. So, there is this opportunity now for a great reset. There's more shuffling around because Gifford becomes Army Group Commander, which is the point at which Slim is made acting Eastern Army Commander. At this time, you're also developing the supply line into Chungking with the flying over the hump. So this is a series of American airfields built in Assam in northeast India, from where they're flying supplies over the Himalayas into China. And there is this general feeling among the President Roosevelt, and the combined chiefs of staff that Southeast Asia does need to be brought into this wider picture of what's going on in the Pacific, the Southern Pacific, what is going on in China, and propping up Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists against Japan, and of course Southeast Asia itself, Burma, Northeast India, and all the rest of it. And they've got to sort it out. And that basically defeat is unconscionable, and they need to find a way forward. But everyone's doing their own kind of different kind of thinking. And it is at the Quebec conference in August 1943 that Mountbatten is posted, which ultimately, as we started, leads to the appointment of Slim as 14th Army Commander. But while he's in this position as acting Eastern Army Commander, he's basically stuck at Barrackpore, which was the original Corps Command before it became the Eastern Army headquarters. And although he doesn't like it does give him this opportunity to just sit and work out what the problems are, bring all that experience he's had, the lucky turns he's had, bring them all together and work out a way through. And first of all, you have to recognize the problems and the challenges. And what he reckons is there are 4 main challenges that he's got to sort out.
It's not like he's Mark Clark thinking, right, what have I got? I've got to do something next. And Alex going, what do we do now? What have we got to do now? It's like, right, we've actually got time to shake this down, prioritize, figure it out. And they're offered a deadline, really.
It's unbelievable. And you can only use the infrastructure you've got to start off with. So the north, you've got the Arakan front, which is, in the big scheme of things, comparatively easy to get through. There aren't decent roads, but there are roads south, from Chittagong to Cox's Bazar, out of Bengal into the Arakan, this northwest area. And of course, you can outflank it by ship. But to get to the northeastern front, this is around the Shanam Saddle where they crossed over back in May 1942 into Manipur State. What you've got to do is you've got to get a railway up north to the Brahmaputra River. Then you have to cross the Brahmaputra River, at which point you're onto a different railway gauge, a narrower gauge, which was built originally just for the tea plantations. So it's kind of, this whole infrastructure has grown up organically rather than as any kind of sort of coordinated whole. And so that's what you've got. So you have to go quite a long way north and northeast to get across the Brahmaputra, which is a mile wide or something. You've got to transfer everything over by kind of ferry, sampan and these kind of small little vessels and crafts and stuff. Then get onto a different gauge railway. Then move it up to Dimapur. Then there is one road south from Dimapur. Just one road, which winds its way through the jungle, through the hills, first to Kohima, which lies on a little kind of low saddle surrounded by hills, and then continues southwards to Imphal. Now, there are airfields at Imphal, but there is only this one road. And then you've got another road that from Imphal, you've got these different spokes heading out. So you've got one that leads up to pretty much eastwards, 40, 50 miles or whatever it is to the Shanam Saddle. And then you've got one, the Tidim Road, which runs south straight into, the Chin Hills down into Burma. But, the railway gauge on the far side of the Brahmaputra River that runs down to Dimapur is designed for transporting only 500, 600 tons daily. But the northeast front of 14th Army requires at least 2,800 tons a day. Now, US engineers have promised to improve that, but they're not due to arrive until the autumn of 1943. The first thing Slim does when he takes over as acting commander is recruit Major General Arthur Alf Snelling. So Alf Snelling is his former quartermaster general in Iraq, and he's a logistical wizard. He always delivers what he promised. And he always says, every time Slim asks him for something, he goes, what you ask is, of course, impossible with the resources we have available, but I will arrange it. And he does. So he thinks, okay, I need Snelling here. So he recalls him from Iraq, gets him to come over. Snelling's now his right-hand man on logistics. The other problem they have is just feeding this kind of, the 500,000 men that are now in 14th Army, when you include your kind of frontline troops, staff troops, service corps, all the rest of it. And you need to give 3 meals a day to 30 different ration scales because of the different ethnic makeup and cultural and religious makeup of the different people.
Who've all been jumbled up because, after all, the revolution, the Indian Mutiny, the lesson of that is that you don't want people in blocks, do you? You need to split them up, is the thinking in the Indian Army at least.
They're restructured, all the infantry divisions are restructured, so you have 3 battalions of 845 men in each of the brigade. And in each of these brigades, you have 1 British battalion, 1 Gurkha battalion, and 1 Indian battalion. But the Indian battalion might be Punjabis or they might be Rajput.
So obviously different dietary requirement.
And it's a problem.
The minute you say, well, I've got a complex ration scale, you then have to push into what the procurement issues are. And they're all over the place, aren't they? So there's a local inefficiency in Delhi colliding with, UK contracts that are cancelled. So basically, Auchinleck then says, well, look, I'll fix this. I'll sort the red tape, carry on. And they develop their own local food sourcing, don't they?
Well,
so
Slim is a great one for thinking, okay, so I understand that Germany's got to be beaten first. I get that. I get that they've got the priority. I completely understand that. I get that we're an outpost. We're just going to have to do what we can, and we're going to have to improvise. Being in that situation where you are forced to improvise, that's going to put you in such a good position later, because it means you can have flexibility. It means you've got that ability to kind of think on your feet and act, comparatively quickly and solve problems on the spot. And they do this by cultivating 18,000 acres for vegetables, for example, up on the northeast front. And they also bring in a whole load of Chinese to help them develop duck farms, for example. So, bottlenecks are cleared. It's a very similar situation to Lord Beaverbrook taking charge of the first Ministry of Aircraft Production in 1940, where traditional channels, peacetime channels of red tape are just slashed in the interest of kind of speeding everything up. But, it's not just food that's short. It's everything. It's ammunition, it's supplies. Even going into the Arakan, there isn't the kind of the road structure. So this is one of the things that I think is just the most amazing thing, is they're thinking, okay, well, we need to improve the road system, because on the coast, it's very it's clay and there isn't much rock because it's coastal. There isn't the shipping to bring over lots of rock from Calcutta or something. So instead, they create a whole load of brick kilns every 20 miles and get Indians of the Indian Tea Association to build brick roads. And they build this huge, great brick road that runs south all the way from, Camilla down to Chittagong to Cox's Bazar and down into the, into the Arakan.
There's a great quote that's Slim's attitude. It's the press club in 1946. No boats, we'll build them. No vegetables, we'll grow them. No eggs, duck farms. No parachutes, we'll use gully, which is jute. No road metal, bake our own bricks and lay them. No airstrips, put down bivvies, which is Hessian strips in bitumen. Malaria, we'll stop it. Medium guns busting, saw off 3 feet the barrel and go on shooting. Their motto, God helps those who help themselves.
Well, absolutely. And so he does improve the situation. The American engineers do come in and sort out the kind of the railway gauge later on. But the other big problem is the illness. And this is just sort of, this is incredibly inhospitable terrain where malaria is rife, where dysentery is rife, where hepatitis is rife, dengue fever, all these kind of horrible lurkies, typhoid, typhus, etc., etc. And the amazing thing is, in 1943, for every 1 man evacuated with battle wounds, 120 were evacuated with illness. And every year, 84% of Eastern Army, then 14th Army, gets malaria. I mean, can you imagine? So Slim just thinks, well, this is ridiculous, because, what's happening is these guys are getting malaria. They're then being shipped back to Calcutta, into hospital in Calcutta. The travel time, getting them there and then getting them back again, takes ages. Then there's a whole disconnection from their units. There's also a kind of suspicion that people are using this as a slightly sort of cushy number, not taking care of themselves, thinking, well, I don't want this, I'll get malaria and then I'll get out of it. So instead, he creates malaria forward treatment units. And these are just a few miles behind lines. And what you do, as soon as you get it, you're taken there, you're treated on the spot, and then you're sent straight back to your unit. And you're told that, you must wear long trousers, you must have your shirts on, after sunset, no one is to have bare skin, as little as possible. Mosquito nets are handed out.
No bathing after dark.
No bathing after dark. And everyone has to take mepicrine tablets. Officers can be sacked if a spot check is done and some of their men haven't taken them.
Yeah, I think there's a battalion commander or two lose their jobs. Fair enough. It's essentially a self-inflicted wound, isn't it, malaria? And if there's things you can do to prevent it.
Well, yes, and his malaria forward treatment units dramatically cut the number of losses, and the use of mepicrine and this insistent and these basic kind of measures, the clothes wearing and not going out after dark and all this kind of stuff, it, dramatically improves the situation. And the turnaround of casualties is also improved, the speed of which it's done. So all in all, that's a kind of great big tick. And also kind of better kind of hygiene on use of water and just general kind of care is dramatically improved. And it's not rocket science, it's all very simple, but it just needs a kind of a single-minded sense of purpose
and a
to
grip
this.
on it. Yeah.
And get a grip on it, exactly. The other thing, of course, is the horror stories of the Japanese, people being butchered and bayoneted and tied to trees, and all of which is true. The worry about this is that you kind of elevate the Japanese onto a kind of pedestal that they frankly don't really deserve. And, they become these sort of Superman. But there's also this fear tied into that of the jungle, of lurking shadows, of pointed bamboos buried into the ground and all this kind of stuff. So what Cinema introduces is much more rigorous jungle training, and not just for frontline infantry units, but for every single man, whether you're a cook, driver, clerk or whatever. Everyone has to be fully trained in jungle training and prepared to take the fight to the Japanese, to kind of kick into touch this sort of sense of the traditional warfare, that this is now asymmetrical warfare, and there can't be any reverses, and you've got to do things in a different way. And it's about teaching men that the jungle is your friend, not your enemy. Use it to your advantage. And of course, tied to the training is the issue of morale. And what's absolutely clear is that when he takes over 14th Army, the newly created 14th Army out of the ashes of Eastern Army, morale is absolutely rock bottom. And you can understand. What he recognises is there are three areas of morale that he needs to improve. The spiritual area, which is the task in hand, is a noble endeavour. And this goes back to what you were saying about, why the hell are they there? That actually ridding the world of the Imperial Japanese and their dodgy ideology.
It's an evil thing. We must destroy the Japanese army, to smash it as an evil thing. To locate that as a morale point, I think is very interesting, because you're not fighting the British Empire. You're destroying something that's evil in itself. So you don't have to clog your head up with, why are we here in the middle of bloody nowhere defending an Indian border? What's the point? You're doing something righteous. And I think that's very interesting. He also talks about how, as an officer, it's his responsibility to make sure his men aren't defeated, because then they'll never pick themselves up again. His focus on morale is so interesting. After all, famously, point 11 of the Jungle Book, which is the manual that they develop, is there will be no withdrawal.
There will be no withdrawals. And the second area is intellectual. And he has to persuade the men that they believe victory is possible. He has to believe it himself. And the third one is material. And this is that they have to believe that they're well equipped, or as well equipped as they might be. And that although they're the forgotten army, they are decently equipped, well fed, infrastructure is improved and cared for and all the rest of it. And so one of the ways they do this is by going around doing these pep talks. Mountbatten is brilliant at this. They both make an absolute point of talking to every Tom, Dick and Harry. This is not just the officers. This is the NCOs. This is the grunts at the bottom of the tree. They all go and see them. And it is absolutely gather around men, stand on the Jeep bonnet. I mean, it is absolutely exactly what Monty is doing in the run-up to D-Day. Exactly the same. There is no difference whatsoever.
There are lots of similarities, actually, aren't there, with this sort of new broom thing of new general. They come in, they agree on what they've got to do. One's doing overview. It is like Alex and Monty in the desert, isn't it? For this campaign, it's a similar moment.
Yes, Mountbatten is the enabler. He is the one who is pulling strings and trying to get the best possible equipment he can, and also trying to kind of work out how they do this, because it's all very well training them. It's all very well, accepting that they're going to have to do this the hard way over the mountain and through jungle and over hills and chongs and all the rest of it. But you also need things like air power, and you need better equipment. And actually, that's where we're going to leave it in this episode, because in addition to this, there are other really important things that are happening in the autumn of 1943, those last months of 1943, in terms of air power, particularly, but also in terms of armor and equipment and how you deploy the weapons you've got to the best effect against the Japanese. And we'll look at that in the next episode. And we'll also, and not before time, have a look at things from the other side of the hill.
Thanks for listening, everyone. If you're in a rush, don't like the adverts, or maybe you're immune to commercial hypnotization, then what you want to do is go to our Apple channel, where you can subscribe, officer class level, and get all this without ads, and all curated into its different subjects. And so you can pick and choose and pop into different things we've talked about before. We will be back, as James says, with the next phase of looking at this Burma 44 in our next episode. Thanks very much for listening, and cheerio.
Cheerio.
So here's the clip from our Vietnam series.
I had expected that when it started, Americans, being Americans, were to be filled with hubris, Nobody's going to be able to stop our military firepower from succeeding. How are these pajama-clad guerrillas possibly going to stop us? I had expected confidence on the part of U.S. commanders. Some of them had it, but certainly most of the civilians, Johnson himself, Robert McNamara, who's the Secretary of Defense, George Bundy, National Security Advisor, the top leadership in Congress, there is a gloomy realism here about what lies ahead. And even now, think about this, even now, Lyndon Johnson tells his wife, Lady Bird, I'm trapped on Vietnam. Whichever way I go, I'm going to lose. He understands right at the beginning that this is going to be his downfall. And this is 1965.
To hear the full series, just search Empire wherever you get your podcasts.